I want to talk about your starting point as a storyteller for a movie like this. Do you start with a situation? Do you start with a character? Do you start with an image? And is it always the same for every movie? And what was the inception for this story itself?
It varies slightly for each film. This is my fourth film, and I've started to get a handle on my process, I think, at this point. I always write on two tracks. Usually I take a genre track, but really it's just things about plot, you know, where the movie's going, what's happening, what blows up, these kinds of questions. And that came very quickly on this film. In fact, that came first. I was struck by the image of two guys in a very fast car driving down a rural back road in the South at night. That was the first image. And that's usually how it starts. That's how it started with Take Shelter. Shotgun Stories, my first film, was a little different. But, I got pretty far along in the trajectory of the story before knowing really what the film was about. And I had done this enough times now. I knew that if my films were at all successful, they were successful in one thing, which is trying to transfer an emotion over to the audience, an emotion that is very personal to me. Oddly enough, I think a lot of times we sit down as writers to try and make universal films, universal stories. And it seems to me, from the analysis of 4 films now, the best way to make something universal is to make it very specific. Make it very specific to your own life. And in this case, I was developing this kind of silly sci-fi chase movie idea while I was in the throes of the first year of fatherhood. And about 8 months into my son's life, he had a febrile seizure, which is the body's reaction to a spike in fever. It doesn't have long-lasting effects, but it was quite terrifying. My wife and I thought he was dying. And it in this first year of fatherhood, where you're sleep deprived and your social life is changing and all these things, it was like dunking my head in cold water. And I woke up very, very quickly to this reality that this boy could be taken away from me. He could die. And I was racked with fear from that. And I started to try and figure out, well, why am I here as a parent? If I can't control his environment, if I can't keep him safe, and if you extrapolate that further and say, I can't control who he becomes, why am I here? And I started to realize, I think as a parent, you're constantly trying to define who your child is. You try not to project who you want them to be. Don't put your point of view on them. You just want to try and define who they are for themselves. And as they grow, you redefine that. And that became really the basis for Mike Shannon's character through the whole film. He has no clue of what his son's doing or where he's going. He's just trying to figure it out and have faith in the idea that he's going someplace he should.
How do you balance those incredibly strong emotions with the genre in which you're working, and also the idea that, and you've said this before, that you don't want to be a slave to plot. In fact, you've said, I think plot is overrated. So how do you go about constructing a movie that's going to serve those emotions that you feel very strongly about, work in the style in which you like to write or make movies, and also fit in the conventions of what some people might expect this movie to do or become?
Right. The more I do this, the more complex that gets, but because you can break it into a few different things. You can break it into, subverting genre, and you can talk about narrative exposition and my desire to remove it at all costs. But I think the key thing to talk about is just character behavior. Mm-hmm. In a screenplay, you have 2 things. You have lines of action and lines of dialogue, and that's it. And in the lines of action, you say the character walks in, sits down, picks up his water. You just explain what he does. It makes no sense to say he walks in, sits down, picks up his water because his mother beat him when he was a kid. That would be stupid. Why would you include that? Because no one's going to see that. So why would you ever include that in the dialogue? I think there's a myth that dialogue is somehow outside of behavior. It's the exact same. Mm-hmm. And so if you've made a rule for yourself as a writer, which I have, which is to treat dialogue strictly as behavior, then you have to look at the situations that the characters are in these scenes, and you have to try and be as honest as you can. We very rarely, save for press tours, say exactly what we want to say. There are very few times where this is calculated and we've had these things thought out. We usually speak in subtext.
I want to talk about your actors in a minute, but I want to talk about your collaborators, because you are a writer-director and you have written and directed all of your movies. But there's also a team around you that is key, and that team includes your cinematographer, Adam Stone, your production designer, Chad Keith, on this film, your composer, David Wingo, and your producer, Sarah Green and Brian Kavanaugh-Jones.
Yes.
So even though you are the writer-director, can you talk about how you work with this group and why they are so essential to what you're able to do?
Yeah, a quick speech on the front of it. It's not just false humility here. People throw out the word auteur and everything else, and yeah, it's flattering. Anyone that's actually been involved in the making of a film knows that it's
pretty much everybody in this room.
It's an absolute lie. To say this is a Jeff Nichols film, it's why I've never taken a possessory credit, to be honest, because it's false. It's fiction. If you took David Wingo, my composer, out of the equation, my films would feel differently. Right. If you took Adam Stone out of the equation, my films would feel differently. So when people say, "Well, that's a Jeff Nichols film," what they're really talking about is this group of people, and I mean that through and through. I've been really lucky to slowly be able to piece together a team that I trust and that know me for who I am. I don't know, it's just like you're in this really amazing band, and you can look at each other's performances and just say, we're all in sync, we're all in rhythm, we're all on the same page.
And your lead vocalist is Michael Shannon, pretty much.
Right.
I assume you
Who
wrote...
is actually a lead vocalist.
Okay. You write for him, you write with him. How do you collaborate with him, and how did you find Jordan Lieberher as your young boy?
Mike's one of the greatest actors in the world, period. And I've worked with some amazing actors, I worked with Matthew McConaughey, I worked with Jessica Chastain, and Mike and I have a very unique relationship. We don't talk very much. We don't really try and go into backstory or anything else beyond the necessities to pull off a scene. We just identify with one another, and I think we identify with these types of characters that I'm writing. And I think he makes me a better writer. I think if I've stated that there's a narrative experiment that I'm attempting with these films of trying to remove exposition, anything unnecessary, you can partly do that because Mike Shannon's going to be there to catch you if you fall. In between the lines, Mike Shannon is going to be emitting this information from his pores, and that's a pretty big safety net as a filmmaker. For Jaden, I typically recoil when I hear the term child actor. I was very lucky in this film Mud that I made to find these two boys that felt like they almost just walked out of the woods. In fact, one did actually walk out of the woods. But and it was my natural instinct to start that casting process again. We saw the 1,000 kids throughout the Southwest and Southeast, and I met a ton of them, and I met some really great kids, and I met some kids that could even handle the lines here and there, and this was a dangerous age though, because this is 8. There's a big difference between 8 and 13. And obviously, now that you've all seen the film, there's a point when this boy is supposed to become aware of his place in the universe. That's a very hard thing to act. That's a very hard thing to pretend. And when I met Jaden, who came to me through CAA, I had like a 10-minute meeting with him in Austin. He came to see me, and I was immediately struck by how aware he was of the situation we were in. He's obviously one of these hyper-intelligent kids, but it wasn't that he was performing. He wasn't tap dancing for me. He just knew where he was at and what the score was, and you could see it in his eyes. And I knew that if he had that capacity, that I could mute him in the first half of the film, stick his nose in a comic book, not give him any lines, and then when I turn him on, he'd be there for me. And I think it works.
Let me ask this last question. The name of the movie is probably inspired by the 1930s or earlier song. Lead Belly covered it. Creedence covered it. I think Van Morrison covered it. Is this a song you heard growing up that stuck with you? Is it the lyric that made you want to name your movie after it?
Yeah, to be honest, it's not as intelligent of an answer as it should be. I just thought it was badass. You know, I grew up listening to this song. I grew up listening to Creedence, and you know, I actually had to go back and discover the Lead Belly version. But that's when I was going through an Alan Lomax period, anyway. But like, you know, like I said, I had this first image: these two guys in a car driving fast down a rural southern road at night. And very quickly after that, I thought I could call it Midnight Special. It just seemed to evoke the tone and the mood that I was going to go after, you know, the colors, and also just the feeling of a late night drive-in movie, you know. That felt fun to me. That felt like something I wanted to spend a few years of my life working on.
And it was a good couple of hours to watch. Jeff Nichols, thank you.
Thank you all
guys for
coming
showing
out.
up.